It looked like a scene from a horror movie, but it was the inauguration of the American government. In a single night at the National Hotel, President-elect James Buchanan and 400 of the nation's most powerful elite collapsed, vomiting blood. This was the National Hotel disease of 1857. Buchanan survived, but he took the oath as a zombie, rotting from the inside, possibly poisoned by political enemies. Was it a catastrophic plumbing failure or a dose of arsenic meant to decapitate the government? This is the story of the poisoned presidency that let the Civil War happen. The trap was set long before the guests arrived. Washington, D.C. in the winter of 1857 was a city built on a swamp, a place where grand neoclassical ambitions constantly battled with the primal mud of the Potomac. It was a capital city on a knife edge, vibrating with the tension of a nation tearing itself apart over the issue of slavery. The Capitol dome itself sat unfinished, a skeleton of iron ribs against a gray winter sky, watching over a city of half-paved streets and raw ambition. Into this cauldron stepped James Buchanan, the president-elect, a tall, heavy-set man with white hair swept high and a peculiar permanent tilt to his head. He was the great hope of the Democratic Party, a northern man with southern sympathies who promised to soothe the fractured Union. To prepare for his inauguration, Buchanan and his sprawling entourage arrived in the Capitol in late January. They chose to reside at the epicenter of Washington society, the National Hotel. More than a hotel, this was the Palace of the South, the unofficial headquarters of the Southern aristocracy in Washington. If you were a power broker, a cotton king, or a senator, you did not just stay here, you lived here. It was gilded, velvet draped, and aggressively opulent. To secure a room at the National was to declare one's arrival in the corridors of power. But beneath the floorboards, something else was fermenting. The winter of 1857 had been historically brutal. The Potomac River had frozen solid, and the city's primitive plumbing systems were pushed to their absolute breaking point. The National Hotel boasted indoor water closets, a rarity for the time, but the labyrinth of pipes hidden within the walls was a ticking time bomb. As the political elite descended on the Capitol, the hotel was overcrowded. Every room was booked. The demand on the kitchen, and crucially, on the cesspools beneath the foundation, was unprecedented. Buchanan checked into the finest suite, bringing with him his nephew and secretary, Eskridge Lane, a vibrant young man of 27, and the cream of the Southern elite. They unpacked their trunks. They prepared for a season of triumph. The heart of their stay was the dining room, a cavernous space where deals were brokered over multi-course feasts. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco, French perfume, and roasting meats. But guests began to notice something strange, a faint, cloying odor in the hallways. The staff dismissed it as the smell of old buildings or the dampness of the winter thaw. The guests, too polite to complain, simply pressed scented handkerchiefs to their noses and continued to eat. They sat at tables laden with oysters, turtle soup, and sherry, unaware that the luxury surrounding them was a facade. They were dining in a tomb, and the first course was about to be served. The catastrophe did not announce itself with the blast of a cannon or the rumble of an earthquake. It arrived under the cover of conviviality, amidst the clatter of silver forks against fine china and the murmur of political gossip. It began on Sunday, January 25th, 1857. The National Hotel was operating at the very limit of its capacity, a hive of activity that buzzed with the excitement of the incoming administration. The dining hall was a sea of black frock coats and silk dresses, illuminated by the warm, flickering glow of gas chandeliers. At the head of the high tables sat James Buchanan, the man of the hour, flanked by the architects of his new government. The mood was triumphant. The wine flowed freely, and the tables groaned under the weight of a banquet prepared by the city's finest French chefs. To the observers in the room, this was the image of a government ascending to power. In reality, it was the last supper of a doomed regime. The transition from celebration to horror was terrifyingly abrupt. It did not ripple through the hotel slowly, it detonated. The first signs were subtle: a guest excusing themselves from a table with a pale complexion, a sudden loss of appetite, a complaint of a strange metallic taste in the mouth. But within hours, the isolated incidents coalesced into a collective nightmare. As the clocks in the hallway chimed the early hours of the morning, the silence of the hotel was shattered. It began on the lower floors and rose upwards like a rising tide. The sound was unmistakable and unnerving, the guttural, violent retching of hundreds of people simultaneously stricken. By dawn on Monday morning, the National Hotel had ceased to be a place of luxury. It had been transformed into a pest house. The scale of the affliction is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. This was not a localized bout of food poisoning affecting a single party or a single table. The sickness swept through the building with the indiscriminate fury of a biblical plague. Estimates suggest that between 300 and 400 people fell ill within a 48-hour window. These were not merely the anonymous masses. These were the titans of American politics: senators, congressmen, foreign diplomats, and their families. The very spine of the United States government was snapped in a single night. The chaos that ensued in the corridors was absolute. The hotel staff, many of whom were enslaved African Americans or Irish immigrants, found themselves overwhelmed by a crisis for which no training could have prepared them. The bells in the servants' quarters rang incessantly, a cacophony of desperate summons from every room. But as the servants rushed to answer the calls, they too began to buckle, clutching their stomachs and collapsing in the service hallways. The infrastructure of the hotel collapsed under the biological assault. There were not enough chamber pots to accommodate the violent purging of 400 victims. There were not enough basins, not enough fresh linens, and certainly not enough water to wash away the evidence of the disaster. The atmosphere in the hotel turned heavy and suffocating. The air circulation, already poor in the winter-sealed building, failed to cope with the sudden miasma. A stench began to permeate the heavy velvet curtains and the wool carpets, a sickly, sweet odor of vomit, dysentery, and unwashed bodies that no amount of potpourri or open windows could dispel. It was the smell of a field hospital after a battle, transplanted into the most expensive drawing rooms in Washington. Guests who were still mobile enough to flee packed their trunks with trembling hands, desperate to escape the cursed building. But for many, flight was impossible. They were pinned to their beds by a fatigue so profound that even lifting a head from a pillow required a Herculean effort. At the epicenter of this swirling madness lay the president-elect. James Buchanan, a man known for his robust constitution and his ability to outdrink and outlast men half his age, was leveled. The attack on his system was ferocious. He was seized by violent cramping that doubled him over, stripping away the dignified veneer of the statesman and reducing him to a writhing figure of agony. The vomiting was relentless, leaving him gasping for air, his throat raw and scorched. For a man of 65 years, carrying the weight of a fracturing nation, the physical toll was catastrophic. His suite, usually the bustling hub of political appointments and strategy meetings, became a darkened sick room. The curtains were drawn tight against the winter sun. The floor was cluttered with basins and discarded towels. His physicians, hovering anxiously by the bedside, were visibly shaken. They had come to Washington to serve a president. Now they fought to keep a patient alive. They watched with mounting dread as Buchanan's complexion turned a ghostly, ashen gray. The flesh seemed to melt from his large frame, leaving his skin hanging loosely. The sheer violence of the purging left him dangerously dehydrated, his pulse threading and weak. Rumors began to leak out of the suite and onto the streets of the capital. Buchanan was dying. The president-elect would not live to see his inauguration. But while Buchanan fought his own private war in the presidential suite, a far more poignant tragedy was unfolding nearby. Among the entourage was Eskridge Lane, Buchanan's favorite nephew and his private secretary. Lane was 27 years old, a young man in the prime of his life, tall, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. He was the son Buchanan never had, the bright future of the family who was expected to rise high in the new administration. When the sickness struck the hotel, Lane was hit with a virulence that shocked even the hardened doctors. Lane's decline was horrifyingly rapid. Unlike Buchanan, whose large frame provided some reserve of strength, Lane seemed to wither instantly. The toxins ravaged his system. He was unable to retain even a drop of water. His agony was audible to those in adjacent rooms, cries of pain that pierced the groans of the other victims. Buchanan, in his lucid moments between bouts of illness, asked constantly for his nephew, but he was too weak to leave his bed to visit him. The separation added a layer of psychological torture to the physical pain. The president-elect lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of his administration dying around him, powerless to intervene. The medical response to the crisis was a tragedy of errors, born of the ignorance of the era. The lobby of the National Hotel became a triage center for the city's physicians. They arrived in droves, carrying black leather bags filled with the instruments of their trade, lancets, leeches, and glass vials of powders. But they were generals fighting a war without a map. Confronted with hundreds of patients exhibiting identical, terrifying symptoms, the medical community fractured into confusion. Some diagnosed it as cholera morbus, a catch-all term for violent gastroenteritis. Others, observing the intense fever and delirium, whispered of typhoid, but the treatments they offered were often worse than the disease itself. In room after room, the scenes were identical and gruesome. Doctors, believing the body was attempting to expel a malignant humor, administered powerful emetics to induce further vomiting in patients who were already dry-heaving bile. They prescribed calomel, a mercury chloride compound that acted as a brutal laxative, accelerating the dehydration that was killing the victims. To silence the screams and the moans that echoed through the thin walls, they dispensed liberal doses of laudanum and morphine. The hotel became a house of drug-induced stupor. By the second day, a strange, eerie quiet began to settle over the upper floors as the opiates took hold. The screaming stopped, replaced by the heavy rattling breathing of the comatose and the dying. News of the disaster spread through Washington like wildfire. The newspapers, initially hesitant to report on the embarrassment of the incoming administration, could no longer ignore the body count. The national hotel disease screamed the headlines. The city was gripped by panic. If the National Hotel, the fortress of the elite, the place with the finest food and the cleanest water, was a death trap, then nowhere was safe. Rumors of a plague began to circulate. People crossed the street to avoid walking in the shadow of the hotel. The carriages that had once lined up to drop off dignitaries now lined up to collect the sick and the dead. For the Southern delegation, who made up the majority of the hotel's guests, the event felt like a biblical judgment. They were the power brokers of the slaveholding states gathered to celebrate their victory in the election. Now they were being decimated. Prominent men like Senator John Slidell of Louisiana and Governor McRae of Mississippi were struck down. The sheer number of Southern victims fueled a dark and dangerous paranoia. In the fevered minds of the sick, this was no accident. The pattern of the victims was too specific. Why were the Republicans staying in other hotels safe and healthy? Why was the sickness confined to the headquarters of the Democrats? Inside the hotel, the situation deteriorated from a medical crisis into a logistical nightmare. The healthy fled, leaving the sick stranded. There were reports of congressmen lying in their own filth for hours because the staff had either fled or were too ill to attend to them. The kitchen, the source of the suspected poison, was shuttered, but the damage was done. The food that remained on the plates in the abandoned dining room rotted where it sat, a grotesque banquet for the flies that began to gather in the unnatural warmth of the heating system. Back in the presidential suite, James Buchanan began to rally, but it was a rally born of desperation rather than healing. He survived the initial onslaught, but he was a changed man. The robust, towering figure was gone. In his place was a trembling, hollow-eyed survivor. But the reprieve was cruel. Just as he began to believe the worst was over, the news reached him that Eskridge Lane was dead. The young man had succumbed to the exhaustion and the internal ravaging. He died in a room just down the hall, his potential unfulfilled, a victim of a dinner party. The death of Eskridge Lane broke something inside Buchanan. It was the first fatality of his administration, a blood sacrifice offered up to the gods of chaos before he had even taken the oath. The grief was compounded by a lingering, gnawing physical pain. Buchanan's digestion was ruined. He lived on a diet of weak tea and gruel, terrified that any solid food would trigger another explosion of agony. He moved with a shuffling gait, clutching his abdomen. The old public functionary had become a geriatric invalid overnight. As the weeks dragged on towards the inauguration, the hotel remained a zone of misery. The first wave of death had passed, but the sickness lingered in the walls. Those who recovered spoke of a lingering malaise, a weakness that settled into the bones and refused to leave. They spoke of a poison that had entered their blood and changed them. The vibrant, aggressive energy that usually characterized the incoming administration was gone, replaced by a sullen, fearful lethargy. The impact on the political machinery of the United States was immediate and profound. Important meetings were canceled because the participants were bedridden. Cabinet positions remained unfilled because the candidates were too weak to travel or too terrified to enter the hotel. The transition of power, usually a period of intense activity and negotiation, ground to a halt. The government was paralyzed not by political deadlock, but by the biological reality of 400 failing bodies. By late February, the true horror of the situation became clear. This was not a passing stomach bug. It was a mass casualty event. The hearses began to make regular calls to the rear entrance of the National Hotel, collecting the bodies of those who had arrived with such high hopes only weeks before. They were carried out in simple pine boxes, often under the cover of darkness to avoid inciting further panic in the capital. The biological tsunami had receded, but it had left behind a landscape of wreckage. It had stripped the new president of his health, his family, and his confidence. And as the survivors looked at each other with sunken eyes, realized with dawning horror that the symptoms were not fading. The swelling in the throats was not going down. The burning in the intestines was returning. The doctors, baffled and terrified, began to whisper among themselves. They compared notes in the hushed corners of the lobby. They spoke of the strange discoloration of the skin, the peculiar resilience of the victim's suffering, and the way the disease seemed to mock their standard treatments. They began to realize that they were not dealing with a disease of nature. They were dealing with something far more sinister. The window of the accident was closing, and the door to the mystery was creaking open. The tsunami had hit, but the monster that caused it was still hiding in the water, waiting for the second course. If the outbreak at the National Hotel was a tsunami, what followed in the privacy of the sick rooms was a slow, agonizing drowning. Away from the panic in the corridors, the true horror was unfolding intimately, silently, inside the human body. Victorian decorum usually shrouds historical death, but the clinical reality of what happened to James Buchanan and 400 other souls defied all convention. It was a transformation so grotesque that it defied the medical lexicons of the era. The victims did not merely sicken, they were invaded. The horror began almost invariably at the mouth. In the terrifying pathology of the National Hotel, the mouth, the instrument of speech, of persuasion, of political power, became the first site of devastation. Doctors attending the patients noted a symptom that was as singular as it was horrifying: the swelling of the tongue. This was not the mild inflammation of a common fever. This was a monstrous, aggressive edema. Witnesses described the tongues of the victims expanding rapidly, filling the oral cavity until they pressed painfully against the teeth. In severe cases, the organ became so engorged that it could no longer be contained within the jaw. It protruded from the lips, a dark, glistening mass of flesh that made speech impossible and swallowing an act of torture. The color of the tissue shifted from a healthy pink to an angry crimson, and finally to a necrotic purplish black. The victims, many of whom were the greatest orators of their generation, were reduced to making guttural, choking sounds, their airways slowly occluding as their own bodies strangled them from the inside. But the tongue was merely the herald of the monster descending into the gullet. As the poison, be it bacterial or chemical, slid down the esophagus, it left a trail of fire. Patients reported a sensation of intense, searing heat, as if they had swallowed molten lead. This burning was not a metaphor. It was the sensation of the mucous membranes of the stomach and intestines being chemically stripped away. The medical reports from the time, written in the cramped, terrified handwriting of overwhelmed physicians, describe a gastrointestinal catastrophe. The vomiting that had heralded the onset of the disease evolved into something far more sinister. Initially, the victims expelled the contents of their stomachs, the undigested remnants of the rich hotel banquet. But soon they began to vomit a substance that baffled the doctors. It was a thick, tenacious mucus, often streaked with bright arterial blood. In the final stages, the vomit turned black and granular, resembling coffee grounds, a classic sign of massive upper gastrointestinal hemorrhage. The stomach lining, perforated and ulcerated, was simply disintegrating. Simultaneously, the victims were racked by a diarrhea of terrifying intensity. It mirrored the symptoms of Asiatic cholera, the great scourge of the 19th century, but with a cruel twist. The stool was watery and incessant, stripping the body of its vital fluids within hours. But unlike cholera, which typically produced rice water stools, the National Hotel disease produced discharges that were dark, bloody, and incredibly foul-smelling. The stench that radiated from the sick beds was described as cadaverous and metallic, a miasma of rotting blood and iron that clung to the hair and skin of the victims, and to the clothes of anyone who dared to tend to them. The speed of the physical deterioration was shocking. This is perhaps the most body horror aspect of the tragedy. A robust senator, weighing 200 pounds and bursting with vitality on a Tuesday, would be reduced to a skeletal wraith by Thursday. The dehydration was so acute that the skin lost all elasticity. If a doctor pinched the skin on the back of a patient's hand, it would remain tented, refusing to snap back like parchment paper. The subcutaneous fat seemed to dissolve overnight. The eyes, deprived of moisture, sank deep into the orbital sockets, creating the haunting facies hippocratica, the mask of death. Their cheeks hollowed out, their temples collapsed, and their lips pulled back from their teeth in a rictus of permanent agony. The pain associated with this dissolution was constant and intractable. Victims spoke of a twisting or knotting in the bowels, a cramping so violent that it caused the abdominal muscles to ripple and spasm visibly beneath the skin. It felt, as one survivor later recounted, as if a hand of iron was gripping the entrails and twisting them without mercy. This was a visceral, tactile agony. They could feel the destruction happening inside them. James Buchanan himself, lying in his darkened suite, complained of a misery in the bowels that made even the pressure of a bedsheet unbearable. What made this medical horror truly psychological was the clarity of mind. Unlike typhoid or typhus, which often plunged the victim into a merciful delirium or stupor, the national hotel disease often left the mind intact until the very end. The victims were fully, terrifyingly awake. They were conscious of their tongue swelling in their mouth. They were conscious of the blood they were weeping. They were conscious of their own rapid decay. They lay in their soiled sheets, watching their hands turn into claws, listening to the doctors whisper in the corner that there was nothing to be done. They were prisoners in a collapsing vessel, witnessing their own autopsy in real time. The devastation extended to the extremities. As the heart struggled to pump thickened, sludge-like blood through the dehydrated veins, circulation to the fingers and toes began to fail. The extremities turned cold and blue, a condition known as cyanosis. The nails turned brittle and dark. The victims complained of a profound, bone-deep chill that no amount of blankets or coal fires could chase away. It was the chill of the grave, settling into the marrow while the heart was still beating. And then there was the thirst, a thirst so consuming, so primal, that it overrode all dignity. Patients begged, screamed, and pleaded for water, but herein lay the cruelest paradox of the disease. The moment water touched their swollen, cracked lips, the moment it slid down their raw throats, the stomach would rebel violently. The water would be expelled immediately, mixed with more blood and bile. They were dying of thirst, yet their bodies violently rejected the only thing that could save them. It was a torture reminiscent of Tantalus, played out in the finest hotel suites in America. For the physician standing by, the clinical picture was a chaotic puzzle. The symptoms mimicked everything and nothing. The bloody flux suggested dysentery. The rapid dehydration suggested cholera. The swollen tongue and throat suggested scarlet fever or diphtheria. But the combination, the specific constellation of the black tongue, the coffee ground vomit, and the metallic taste pointed to something outside the realm of natural disease. It pointed towards toxicology. In the 19th century, the symptoms of arsenic poisoning were well documented in the annals of forensic science. Arsenic was the king of poisons, the weapon of choice for the silent assassin. Its signature was the destruction of the gastrointestinal tract, the burning fire in the gut, the unquenchable thirst, and crucially, the inflammation of the mouth and throat. As the doctors wiped the bloody froth from the lips of the dying congressman, they could not help but notice the terrifying similarity. The pathology they were witnessing was not the random work of bacteria. It bore the precise, brutal hallmarks of a heavy metal assault. Even the survivors were not spared the monster's mark. Those who did not die in the acute phase, like Buchanan, were left with bodies that were permanently altered. The lining of their intestines was scarred, leaving them with chronic dyspepsia and an inability to digest rich food ever again. Their immune systems were ravaged, leaving them susceptible to every draft and chill. They carried the memory of the monster in their very tissue. They were hollowed-out men, zombie politicians who walked and talked, but whose vital spark had been dimmed by the trauma of those dark weeks. The monster within was not just a killer, it was a humiliator. It took the most powerful men in the nation, men who commanded armies and debated the Constitution, and reduced them to frightened, soiled children, crying out for water they could not drink. It stripped them of their dignity before it stripped them of their lives. In the quiet horror of the national hotel rooms, the biological reality of the human animal was laid bare in all its gruesome vulnerability. The gold leaf of the hotel walls looked down on the gray flesh of the dying, and the silence was broken only by the sound of labored, fluid-filled breathing. The tsunami had passed, but the wreckage it left behind was rotting. If the disease itself was a monster, the men who arrived to fight it were tragically its unwitting accomplices. As the panic at the National Hotel reached its fever pitch, the lobby became a staging ground for the medical elite of Washington, D.C. They arrived in their somber black frock coats, carrying leather bags, heavy with the authority of their profession. To the terrified families watching from the stairwells, these men looked like saviors. They were the professors of anatomy, the surgeons of the best hospitals, the guardians of public health. But in the winter of 1857, the distance between a doctor and an executioner was often measured only by intent. In 1857, the distance between a healer and an executioner was often measured only by intent. To grasp the horror of the sick rooms, one must step back into a world where the germ theory of disease was still a fiercely debated heresy, where antibiotics were the stuff of science fiction, and where the stethoscope was a novelty. The medical philosophy of the era was dominated by the concept of heroic medicine. It was a doctrine built on violence. The prevailing belief was that disease was caused by an imbalance of the bodily humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To cure a patient, the doctor had to shock the system back into balance. The sickness had to be driven out by force, and so the physicians of the National Hotel did not come to soothe. They came to assault. The first weapon in their arsenal was perhaps the most insidious, for it came disguised as a harmless white powder. It was called calomel. To the Victorian physician, calomel was a miracle drug, a panacea prescribed for everything, from teething babies to dying soldiers. Chemically, however, it was mercurous chloride, a toxic compound of mercury. When the doctors leaned over the sweating, writhing bodies of the senators and congressmen, they saw the violent vomiting and diarrhea not as a symptom of poisoning or infection, but as a sign that the body was choked with bilious matter. Their solution was to open the floodgates. They administered massive, heroic doses of calomel to act as a purgative. The logic was terrifyingly simple. If the patient is sick, make them emptier. The effect on the already ravaged bodies of the victims was catastrophic. The specific pathology of acute mercury poisoning, induced by the very hand sworn to heal, reveals a horror distinct from the disease itself. Once ingested, the calomel began its work. It did indeed purge the bowels, stripping the intestinal lining of whatever mucus and moisture remained. But as the mercury accumulated in the system, a new grotesque set of symptoms emerged, symptoms that the doctors often mistook for the progression of the national hotel disease rather than the result of their own prescriptions. The most horrific manifestation was a condition known politely as ptyalism, or excessive salivation. But this description fails to capture the visceral reality. The patient's salivary glands, overstimulated by the heavy metal, began to produce pints, sometimes quarts, of thick, foul-smelling saliva every day. It drooled uncontrollably from their swollen lips, soaking their pillows and bedclothes. It was a humiliating, dehumanizing flow that the patients were too weak to wipe away. But the mercury did not stop at the glands. It attacked the soft tissue of the mouth. The gums of the victims began to turn soft and spongy. They bled at the slightest touch. Then they began to recede. In the flickering gaslight of the hotel rooms, horror-struck relatives watched as the teeth of their loved ones, men in the prime of life, began to loosen in their sockets. Some victims spat out their own teeth into the bloody basins held by their nurses. In the most severe cases, the toxicity led to mercurial gangrene. The tissue of the cheeks and the jawbone itself began to rot while the patient was still alive. The smell of necrotic flesh, mixing with the metallic reek of the mercury and the stench of the dysentery, created an atmosphere in the sick rooms that was physically repellent. The cure was literally rotting the faces of the president's inner circle. Yet the doctors, blinded by the dogma of their training, often interpreted this salivation as a sign of success. "The system is responding," they would murmur. "The humors are flowing." And so they would mix another dose of the white powder. If calomel was the chemical assault, the next stage of treatment was the physical one. The doctors were baffled by the persistence of the nausea. The victims were dry heaving, their stomach muscles seized in agonizing spasms, bringing up nothing but bile and blood. To the modern mind, the solution would be to settle the stomach, to rehydrate. To the 19th century mind, the retching indicated that there was still poisonous matter trapped in the stomach that needed to be expelled. Enter the emetic. The substance of choice was often tartar emetic, a compound of antimony. It was a potent irritant. When fed to the patients, often forced between clenched bleeding gums, it induced violent spasmodic vomiting. Imagine the torture of this: a body that has been retching for 24 hours, a throat that is raw and bleeding, an esophagus that is scorched, being chemically forced to retch again. The physical exertion of this induced vomiting was often the final blow for the weakened heart. The sheer strain caused capillaries in the eyes to burst, leaving the victim staring up at the doctors with blood-red eyes. It caused ruptures in the stomach lining. It exhausted the last reserves of energy that the body needed to fight the actual infection. The doctors were effectively beating the patients to death from the inside, convinced they were scrubbing the vessel clean. There were other remedies employed in this theater of cruelty. For those complaining of the fire in the gut, doctors applied mustard plasters or turpentine-soaked rags to the abdomen. These counter-irritants were designed to draw the inflammation to the surface. In reality, they blistered the skin, adding the agony of chemical burns to the internal torture. The skin of the president-elect and his colleagues was subjected to blistering heat, leaving raw, weeping wounds on their bellies, adding yet another portal for infection in the filthy hotel environment. And then, when the screaming became too much, when the thrashing of the patients threatened to disturb the decorum of the hotel, the doctors played their final card, the silencer, laudanum. It was the aspirin of the Victorian age, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. It was cheap, it was potent, and it was available by the gallon. Faced with the intractable pain of the National Hotel disease, the twisting bowels, the rotting gums, the blistered skin, the doctors dispensed laudanum with a liberal hand. The shift in the hotel's atmosphere was palpable. The frantic energy of the initial outbreak, the cries, the running footsteps, gave way to a heavy narcotic silence. The drug did not cure the disease, it merely masked the dying. It paralyzed the gut, which temporarily stopped the diarrhea, but at a terrible cost. It locked the toxins inside the body, allowing them to ferment and absorb further into the bloodstream. But the most profound effect was on the mind. James Buchanan, a man known for his sharp legal mind and meticulous nature, was plunged into an opium haze. The drug dulled the pain, yes, but it also dulled the will. It turned the patients into pliant, glassy-eyed dolls. They lay in a twilight state, hovering between consciousness and coma. Their breathing became shallow and slow, the opium rattle. This was the birth of the zombie aspect of the tragedy. Under the influence of laudanum, the president-elect and his cabinet were stripped of their agency. They were propped up in bed, nodding in and out of conversations, agreeing to things they did not understand, signing papers they could not read. The eyes that looked out from the pillows were pinpricks, the pupils constricted to tiny black dots, a hallmark of opiate intoxication. The psychological horror for the families was unique. They watched their husbands and fathers retreat into a chemical fog. The man in the bed looked like their loved one, but there was no light behind the eyes. He was a husk, kept breathing by the very poison that was erasing his personality. In the case of James Buchanan, the reliance on opiates and stimulants established a dangerous precedent. To combat the depressant effects of the laudanum, doctors would often administer brandy or other strong spirits. The president-elect was caught in a pharmacological riptide, sedated to stop the pain, then stimulated to feign vitality. His system was whipped and then drugged over and over again. It is no wonder that the man who eventually emerged from the National Hotel was described as broken. His nervous system had been subjected to a chemical assault that would have shattered a man half his age. There is a particular cruelty in iatrogenic death, death caused by the healer. As the death toll mounted, the doctors did not retreat. They doubled down. They argued that the patients who died had simply been too weak, or that the treatment had started too late. They did not see or refused to see the correlation between the massive doses of mercury and the gangrenous mouths. They did not link the forced vomiting to the heart failures. In the quiet, candlelit corners of the hotel rooms, a terrifying intimacy developed between the tormentor and the tormented. The doctor would lean in, whispering words of encouragement, "Just one more draft, sir, to clear the bile." And the patient, trusting, desperate, would open his bleeding mouth and swallow the poison. It was a betrayal of the most fundamental trust. The butcher's blade was not made of steel. It was made of ignorance. It was made of white powders and brown liquids. It was made of the arrogance of a medical profession that believed it could conquer nature with brute force. By the time the acute phase of the crisis began to wane, the survivors were left to reckon with the damage. They were alive, but at what cost? Their teeth were loose or gone. Their digestion was permanently ruined by the harsh purgatives. Their livers and kidneys were taxed to the limit by the processing of heavy metals. And in their minds, the fog of the opium lingered, a shadowy veil that would never quite lift. James Buchanan survived the doctors, but he did not escape them. He carried the scars of their heroism to his grave. The old public functionary had been hollowed out, scraped clean of his vitality by the very men who had sworn to protect him. He walked out of the National Hotel, not just a survivor of a mysterious plague, but a survivor of a medical torture chamber. The monster within had been fed by the very hands that tried to starve it. Finding the true author of this tragedy requires descending past the velvet-draped bedside, past the bustling kitchens, into the dark, wet, and fetid underbelly of the Capitol. For while the doctors were looking at tongues and mixing powders, the real killer was lurking in the architecture itself. The National Hotel was not merely a building. By the winter of 1857, it had become a biological weapon, primed by the weather and detonated by neglect. The investigation into the National Hotel disease remains one of the first great epidemiological detective stories in American history, though it was conducted in an era before the detective existed as a profession. As the bodies piled up and the rumors of arsenic poisoning reached a hysterical pitch, the hotel management, desperate to save their investment, quietly commissioned a review of the premises. What they found was a horror far more grotesque than any political assassination plot. They found that the hotel was, quite literally, drowning in its own filth. Washington, D.C. in the mid-19th century was a city built on a compromise, rising out of a tidal swamp. Its drainage was atrocious. The sewers of the time were often little more than open ditches or brick-lined tunnels that emptied sluggishly into the Potomac. The National Hotel, as the premier establishment of the city, boasted modern conveniences, including indoor water closets, a luxury that was still a novelty to many Americans. But this modernity was a veneer. The technology of sanitation was in its infancy, and the hotel was an experiment that had gone catastrophically wrong. The winter of 1857 was the catalyst. It was bitterly, relentlessly cold. The temperature dropped so low that the Potomac River froze solid, allowing daring souls to walk across the ice. But deep beneath the streets, a more dangerous freezing was taking place. The main sewer line, into which the National Hotel discharged its massive volume of daily waste, was relatively shallow. As the frost line penetrated deep into the ground, the slurry of human waste, kitchen grease, and gray water in the pipes began to slow, then thicken, and finally to freeze solid. The hotel, however, was fully booked. 400 guests plus hundreds of staff continued to use the facilities. They continued to flush the water closets. They continued to pour water down the drains. With the outlet blocked by a plug of ice, the effluent had nowhere to go. It began to back up. The investigators who ventured into the cellar of the National Hotel were met with a scene from Dante's Inferno. The basement, usually used for storage and coal, was awash. The pressure from the backed-up sewer line had forced the raw sewage back through the hotel's own pipes, fracturing the clay and lead fittings. The floor was covered in a slick, noxious sludge of human excrement. But it was the air that was truly lethal. In the 1850s, medical science was obsessed with the theory of miasma, the idea that diseases were spread by bad air or foul odors arising from decaying matter. While the germ theory would later prove this technically incorrect. In the case of the National Hotel, the miasma theory was terrifyingly close to the truth. The trapped sewage was fermenting. In the anaerobic darkness of the pipes, bacteria were breaking down the organic matter, producing massive quantities of sewer gas, a toxic cocktail of methane, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide. Normally, P-traps or U-bends in the plumbing would hold a small amount of water to block these gases from rising back up into the building. But the pressure from the frozen blockage was immense. It blew the water out of the traps. The National Hotel effectively became a giant chimney for the sewer. The warm air inside the heated hotel rose, creating a vacuum that sucked the freezing, gas-laden air from the basement up through the walls. The investigators realized with dawning horror that the strange cloying odor guests had complained of was not damp plaster. It was the breath of the sewer. The hydrogen sulfide, with its characteristic smell of rotten eggs, was seeping into the dining room, into the bedrooms, and into the lungs of the president-elect. While hydrogen sulfide in high concentrations can kill instantly, in lower chronic doses it causes nausea, headaches, and a suppression of the immune system. The guests were being slowly gassed in their sleep. But gas alone could not explain the violent, dysenteric nature of the deaths. Gas does not cause the bowels to liquidate or the tongue to swell with such ferocity. For that, there had to be a vehicle of transmission. There had to be something they were ingesting. The investigation moved from the cellar to the attic, and it is here, in the freezing, cobwebbed crawl spaces beneath the roof, that the true, nauseating, grotesque reality of the National Hotel revealed itself. The water supply for the hotel did not come from a pristine spring. It was pumped up to massive wooden cisterns located in the attic. These tanks relied on gravity to feed the water down to the taps, the kitchens, and the water closets. The tanks were lined with lead, a hazard in itself, but the real danger was their construction. They were open-topped. They were vast, stagnant ponds sitting in the dark, warm attic space directly above the heated rooms. When the investigators lifted their lanterns to inspect the tanks, the light fell upon a surface that was not clear. It was covered in a thick, oily scum. But as they looked closer, peering into the murky depths, the shapes resolved themselves. The winter cold that had frozen the sewers had also driven the vermin of Washington to seek warmth. The attic of the National Hotel, heated by the chimneys passing through it, was a haven. Rats, mice, and bats had swarmed into the roof space. Thirsty and disoriented in the dark, they had crawled onto the rims of the water tanks. Many had slipped. The investigators found the tanks filled with the bloated, decomposing bodies of dozens of rats and bats. Imagine the biology of this. A rat carrying the filth of the city on its fur falls into the water. It swims until it is exhausted. It drowns. Then the process of putrefaction begins. The body bloats. The gases of decay cause it to float, then sink, then float again. The fur sloughs off. The abdomen bursts, releasing the contents of the rat's intestines, bacteria, parasites, viruses, into the water. This was the water that flowed down into the heavy iron stock pots of the French chefs. This was the water used to boil the potatoes. This was the water used to make the tea that James Buchanan sipped every morning to settle his stomach. This was the water used to wash the salad greens that provided the crunch at the gala dinners. The elite of America were not just drinking dirty water, they were drinking a soup of liquefied vermin. They were consuming a broth of cadaverine and putrescine, but the horror of the water tanks had a second, even more repulsive layer. The plumbing design of the National Hotel was fatally flawed. The overflow pipes from these attic water tanks were connected directly to the soil pipes, the sewer lines, without a break. When the sewer froze and the pressure built up in the basement, the laws of physics took over. The back pressure didn't just push gas up, it pushed liquid. The raw sewage from the basement, unable to exit into the Potomac, was forced up the waste pipes. It rose past the first floor, past the second, past the third. It reached the level of the attic. And there it regurgitated into the water tanks. It was a closed loop of consumption. The waste that the guests flushed down the toilets one day was mixed with the decomposing rats churned in the icy pipes and returned to their water goblets the next. It was a cycle of autocoprophagia, the unwitting consumption of one's own waste. From a modern bacteriological perspective, the tank was a biological reactor. The specific killer was likely Shigella dysenteria, the bacteria that causes bacillary dysentery. Shigella is a particularly vicious pathogen. It produces the Shiga toxin, which destroys the lining of the intestines, leading to the bloody flux that decimated the guests. It is highly contagious and thrives in water contaminated by feces. Alongside Shigella, there was likely Salmonella typhi, the agent of typhoid fever. This explains the high fevers, the delirium, and the lingering, wasting death of victims like Eskridge Lane. And we cannot rule out the presence of leptospirosis transmitted through the urine of the drowning rats, which would cause the kidney failure and the yellowing of the skin seen in many victims. The investigation revealed that the National Hotel disease was not a single illness. It was a polymicrobial assault. The victims were being attacked by a swarm of different pathogens simultaneously. Their immune systems were fighting a war on 5 fronts: dysentery, typhoid, sewer gas poisoning, lead leaching from the tank linings, and the general toxicity of rotting carrion. The tragedy lies in the juxtaposition. Downstairs, the guests were complimenting the clarity of the consommé, marveling at the delicacy of the tea. They believed they were tasting the height of civilization. In reality, they were tasting the raw, unfiltered biological reality of the swamp. The crystal goblets held death. The silver tureens held pestilence. When the findings of the sanitary engineers began to circulate, whispered at first, then shouted, the reaction was one of collective nausea. The revulsion was overwhelming. It shattered the psyche of the survivors. To know that one has been poisoned by a political enemy is frightening, but it retains a certain tragic dignity. It implies one is important enough to kill, but to know that one has been poisoned by drinking rat soup and recycled sewage, that is humiliating. It is abject. James Buchanan, a man who prided himself on his fastidious habits, on his clean linen and his Madeira wine, had been reduced to a scavenger. The knowledge of what he had ingested likely contributed to his psychological collapse. How does a man stand on the inauguration podium, representing the purity of the Republic, when he knows his own body is a vessel for such filth? The cesspool theory also explained the randomness of the death. Why did some die and some live? It depended on the specific ladle of water. One scoop might contain a high concentration of the bacterial colony from a burst rat carcass. The next might be relatively diluted. It depended on whether the water was boiled for tea or drunk cold. It was a game of Russian roulette played with a water pitcher. The revelation of the attic tanks stripped away the glamour of the National Hotel forever. It was no longer a palace. It was a whited sepulchre, beautiful on the outside, but inside full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. The luxury was the trap. The heavy curtains trapped the gas. The complex plumbing trapped the waste. The heating system incubated the bacteria. The National Hotel was a machine designed to kill its occupants, fueled by the very excrement of the power it housed. As the investigators retreated from the attic, covering their mouths against the stench of the disturbed tanks, they carried with them the answer to the mystery. But it was an answer that the public found hard to accept. It was too gross, too simple, and too random. It lacked the drama of assassination. And so, despite the physical evidence of the rats and the sewage, the shadow of the arsenic theory refused to fade. The human mind prefers a villain with a face to a villain that is merely a plumbing failure. And for James Buchanan, the terror of the poison was about to curdle into the terror of a conspiracy. The revelation of the sewage-tainted water tanks and the decomposing rats in the attic provided a nauseatingly physical explanation for the catastrophe at the National Hotel. It was a solution that satisfied the sanitary engineers and the drain layers, But it did not satisfy the public. And crucially, it didn't satisfy the victims. The human mind is a storytelling machine. It craves narrative, meaning, and agency. The idea that the entire leadership of the United States could be decapitated by a frozen pipe and a clumsy rat was simply too banal, too accidental to be accepted. It lacked the weight of tragedy. In the fevered, polarized atmosphere of 1857, with the nation teetering on the brink of civil war, accidents were not allowed to happen. Everything had to be a plot. And so, as the bodies were carted away, the theory of the cesspool was quietly discarded by the popular imagination, replaced by a theory far more sinister, far more dramatic, and far more consistent with the violence of the age, the arsenic shadow. The poison theory took a stranglehold on the American psyche because the forensic evidence, seen through 19th century eyes, was compelling. The symptoms of the national hotel disease overlapped with the symptoms of acute arsenic poisoning to a degree that was nothing short of chilling. In the annals of Victorian crime, arsenic was known as the king of poisons and the poison of kings. It was odorless, tasteless, and readily available in everything from rat poison to cosmetic powders. It was the weapon of choice for the disgruntled wife, the greedy heir, and, historically, the political assassin. The doctors who attended Buchanan and his nephew noted the specific presentation of the illness. The burning gut, the dehydration, and the relentless nausea were all classic hallmarks of arsenic ingestion. But it was the throat that convinced the skeptics. Arsenic causes a specific constriction and inflammation of the larynx and the esophagus. The swelling of the tongue, the difficulty in swallowing, and the sensation of being strangled from the inside, these were the signature calling cards of the heavy metal. But there was a more macabre piece of evidence that was whispered in the undertaking parlors of Washington. Arsenic has a unique chemical property. It is a preservative. It kills the bacteria that cause decomposition. In the 19th century, before modern refrigeration, bodies would rot quickly. Yet rumors circulated that the victims of the National Hotel disease were eerily well preserved. Their bodies did not bloat or decay at the normal rate. They looked mummified, their flesh staying firm long after death. To the superstitious and the suspicious, this was the final damning proof. The victims had been pickled in poison while they were still alive. If we accept for a moment the premise of murder, the next question is the detective's eternal query. Cui bono? Who benefits? The political landscape of 1857 provides a surplus of motives. James Buchanan was not a beloved figure. He was the doughface, a Northerner with Southern sympathies. He was viewed by the abolitionists of the North not merely as a political opponent, but as a moral monster, a collaborator with the slave power. The anger against him was biblical in its intensity. The country was already bleeding. Fighting had broken out in Kansas. Senators were being beaten with canes on the floor of Congress. The idea of political violence was not abstract. It was the daily reality. The conspiracy theory, fanned by Southern newspapers, posited that this was a calculated massacre orchestrated by radical abolitionists. The logic was cold and brutal. The South had won the election, but the North could win the inauguration. If Buchanan and his Southern-dominated cabinet could be wiped out before March 4th, the government would be thrown into chaos. It would be a decapitation strike against the institution of slavery. The press began to spin a narrative of a vast, invisible network of assassins. Who worked in the kitchens of the National Hotel? Who carried the water? Who stirred the soup? In many cases, it was enslaved African Americans or Irish immigrants, groups that were viewed with deep suspicion by the Southern elite. The theory went that an abolitionist agent had infiltrated the staff, or perhaps bribed a disgruntled servant to slip a packet of white powder into the sugar bowl used for the president's tea or into the communal water supply. This theory explained the timing. Why did the sickness strike specifically during the victory dinners? Why did it seem to target the Democratic leadership while leaving other guests, Republicans staying at Willard's Hotel, unharmed? The sanitation theory argued that the Democrats simply outnumbered everyone else at the National, but the conspiracy theorists saw a targeted hit. They pointed to the fact that Buchanan was struck down not once but twice. He fell ill in late January, recovered slightly, returned to the hotel, and was immediately struck down again. To the paranoid mind, this was not a re-exposure to bad water. This was a second attempt by an assassin who had failed the first time. For James Buchanan, lying in his darkened room, the arsenic shadow was not a theoretical exercise. It was a psychological torture. Imagine the state of mind of the president-elect. He is in severe pain, his body betraying him. He is told that the water might be sewage. He is told that the tea might be poison. He is told that half the country wishes him dead. Paranoia began to set in like a rot. Buchanan was already a man of nervous disposition, prone to fussiness and rigidity. The poisoning shattered his sense of security. Witnesses described him as eyeing his food with suspicion. Every meal became a game of Russian roulette. Was the soup safe? Was the wine tampered with? There are reports, though perhaps apocryphal, of unofficial tasters being used, or of Buchanan refusing to eat anything that hadn't been prepared by his own trusted personal servants. This paranoia extended beyond the plate. It seeped into his politics. If the North was willing to poison him, how could he possibly negotiate with them? How could he trust a Republican congressman if he believed that same congressman's faction had tried to dissolve his intestines with arsenic? The physical poisoning fed a political poisoning. It hardened his heart against the North. It confirmed his belief that the abolitionists were not just misguided, but demonic. The arsenic shadow effectively killed any chance of Buchanan being a neutral arbiter. He saw himself as a survivor of an assassination attempt, and he identified his would-be killers as the enemies of the South. The atmosphere in the National Hotel during those final weeks was straight out of a noir thriller. The gaslights seemed to burn dimmer. The servants moved like ghosts, aware that they were being watched, aware that every move of a ladle or a pitcher was being scrutinized for malice. The guests who remained were jumpy, aggressive, and fearful. The camaraderie of the victory had evaporated, replaced by the icy silence of suspicion. The investigation into the plot was chaotic and fueled by rumor. There were whispers of a mysterious man seen near the water tanks. There were stories of a chemist in Baltimore who had sold a large quantity of arsenic to a tall stranger just days before the outbreak. None of these leads ever amounted to a concrete arrest, but they didn't need to. The damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. One of the most compelling aspects of the poison theory was the phantom culprit. Because arsenic is tasteless and can be administered over time, the killer doesn't need to be in the room. They can poison the sugar supply on Monday and kill the victim on Friday. This invisibility was terrifying. It meant the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. It meant that the walls of the National Hotel offered no protection. The press played a dangerous game. Northern newspapers mocked the idea of a plot, calling it Southern hysteria, and pointing gleefully to the filth of the hotel as proof of Southern incompetence in hygiene. Southern newspapers screamed for justice, demanding an investigation into the black Republicans and their murderous tricks. The National Hotel disease became a partisan issue. Even the bacteria was politicized. Returning to the man at the center of the web, James Buchanan prepared for his inauguration under a cloud of doom. He was a man who believed he had been marked for death. This belief is crucial to understanding his subsequent failure as president. A man who thinks he is being hunted does not lead boldly. He hides, he equivocates, he tries to survive. The physical toll of the suspected arsenic or the actual dysentery combined with the psychological toll of the suspected assassination created a unique form of PTSD. Buchanan felt besieged. The White House, which should have been a fortress of executive power, felt to him like another trap. If they could get to him in the National Hotel, surely they could get to him in the executive mansion. It is also worth noting the medical response to the poison theory. If the doctors suspected arsenic, their treatments would have shifted. The standard antidote for arsenic in 1857 was hydrated ferric oxide, essentially rust suspended in water. It was not a gentle cure. If this was administered alongside the mercury and the opium, it would have added another layer of chemical insult to Buchanan's stomach. The cure for the assassination attempt would have been just as damaging as the attempt itself. Ultimately, the arsenic shadow is a story about the loss of innocence. Before 1857, the presidency was seen as a sacrosanct office, protected by the goodwill of the people. Assassination was a European problem, a disease of monarchies, not republics. The National Hotel disease changed that. It introduced the idea that the president could be a target. It introduced the idea that political differences could be settled with lethal force. Whether or not a single grain of arsenic was ever actually slipped into the soup is, in the end, historically irrelevant. The belief in the poison was real. The fear was real. The hatred that fueled the theory was real. The National Hotel became a microcosm of the Union itself, a beautiful structure built on a shaky foundation, filled with people who supposedly belonged to the same nation, but who looked at each other across the dinner table and saw only murderers. As March 4th approached, the investigation fizzled out. No poisoner was caught. No abolitionist cell was uncovered. The rats in the tank remained the official explanation. But as James Buchanan packed his trunks to leave the hotel, he didn't look like a man who believed in rats. He looked like a man who knew he had escaped a hit. He looked over his shoulder. He checked his water glass. And he carried the cold metallic taste of fear with him into the presidency. The poison, real or imagined, had done its work. The man who walked out of the National Hotel was not the leader the country needed. He was a survivor, and survivors are often haunted by the ghosts of what they have endured. The stage was now set for the final tragedy. The biological tsunami had receded. The investigation had hit a dead end. All that remained was the inauguration. But the man who would take the oath was no longer James Buchanan. He was something else, something less. He was a vessel hollowed out by pain, preserved by opium, and animated only by duty. The zombie president was ready to take office. James Buchanan survived the National Hotel. In the strict biological sense, the organism continued to function. The heart beat, the lungs inflated, and the brain fired its synapses. But the man who emerged from the sick room in the spring of 1857 was not the man who had entered it. He was an echo. He was a survivor, yes, but he was a survivor who had left the essential part of his vitality amongst the soiled sheets and the medicine bottles of his hotel suite. To comprehend the disastrous presidency that followed, one must confront the creature the poison created, the zombie. The emptiness defining Buchanan's final years, however, had roots reaching back nearly 40 years, to a time before the gray hair and the wry neck, to a tragedy that had already cracked the foundation of his soul long before the arsenic or the sewage ever touched his lips. The story of James Buchanan is a story bookended by two poisons. The first poison was laudanum. In 1819, Buchanan was a dashing, ambitious young lawyer in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He was not yet the old public functionary. He was vibrant, sharp, and deeply in love. Her name was Anne Caroline Coleman. She was the daughter of an iron millionaire, a woman of beauty, intelligence, and a fragile, high-strung temperament. They were engaged to be married, a match that promised to be the crowning achievement of Buchanan's young life. But Buchanan was a man married to his work. His ambition kept him late at the law office, and his calculated charm with other women, perhaps innocent, perhaps not, sparked rumors. In the small, gossiping circles of Lancaster, whispers reached Anne that Buchanan was only after her fortune. The engagement soured. In a fit of pride and hurt, she broke it off. Days later, Anne Coleman was dead. The official cause was hysterical convulsions, a euphemism of the era. The truth, whispered in every drawing room in Pennsylvania, was suicide. In her despair, Anne had taken a massive overdose of laudanum, a tincture of opium. She had drifted into a sleep from which she never woke, her heart stopped by the very drug that was meant to soothe her nerves. The impact on Buchanan was cataclysmic. When he asked to attend the funeral, Anne's father returned his letter unopened, effectively branding him a murderer. Buchanan was crushed. He wrote, "I feel that my happiness is buried with her in the grave." He vowed never to marry, a vow he kept until his dying day, becoming the only lifelong bachelor to ever occupy the White House. This backstory is not merely a romantic footnote, it is the psychological key to the zombie president. For 40 years, Buchanan carried this guilt. He buried his emotions under a layer of rigid legalism and obsessive work. He became a man of rules because feelings had led to death. And now in 1857, the irony of history closed its jaws around him. The poison that had killed his fiancée, laudanum, became the very substance that was sustaining him. To cope with the agonizing cramps and the relentless dysentery caused by the national hotel disease, Buchanan was prescribed daily heavy doses of opiates. The psychological horror was absolute every time he raised the glass of dark liquid to his lips. To stop the pain, to stop the pain, to stop the pain, he was tasting the agent of his lover's death. He was existing in the same chemical haze that had taken her. The past and the present collapsed into a singular narcotic nightmare. The old bachelor was trapped in a cycle of trauma mediated by the poppy. As Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1857, finally arrived, the extent of Buchanan's physical devastation became undeniable. The day was sunny and mild, a cruel contrast to the winter that had preceded it. The crowds gathered in their thousands, eager to see the new leader. But inside his carriage, James Buchanan was trembling. He was terrified of an accident. His bowels were so unpredictable, his stomach so ravaged, that he feared he would soil himself during the ceremony. To prevent a public humiliation, his doctors had devised a potent cocktail, a mixture of chalk to bind the stomach, laudanum to kill the pain, and heavy stimulants, brandy or whiskey, to provide artificial energy. When he stepped onto the platform at the east port of the Capitol, he looked like a ghost. Observers noted his pallor. His skin, usually ruddy, was the color of old parchment. His large frame seemed to have shrunk inside his suit. He delivered his inaugural address, but his voice, once booming and authoritative, was weak. The wind carried his words away before they could reach the crowd. He spoke of unity, of the Constitution, of peace, but the man speaking was a puppet, propped up by invisible strings of chemistry. He took the oath of office. He kissed the Bible. But in that moment, The presidency effectively died. The man who assumed the powers of the commander-in-chief was not a leader, he was a patient. The zombie syndrome began to manifest immediately. The national hotel disease had left Buchanan with a chronic, debilitating condition known as enteritis, inflammation of the intestine. For the next 4 years, he would be plagued by constant violent diarrhea. We must be unflinching about what this means. History often sanitizes the physical reality of its figures, but we cannot understand Buchanan's failure without understanding his body. A man who is in constant pain, a man who cannot venture far from a water closet, a man who is severely dehydrated, is not a man capable of bold, decisive action. Chronic pain rewires the brain. It makes the sufferer risk-averse. It creates a tunnel vision where the only goal is the cessation of suffering. Buchanan retreated into the White House as if it were a hospice. He avoided confrontation because confrontation caused stress, and stress triggered his illness. When the crises of the nation arrived, Bleeding Kansas, the John Brown raid, the Dred Scott decision, they were met not by a vigorous executive, but by an invalid wrapped in a shawl, sipping weak tea and hoping the world would go away. The zombie nature was not just physical, it was spiritual. The poison seemed to have stripped him of his moral imagination. He became passive, reactive, a spectator in his own administration. He relied heavily on his cabinet, many of whom were Southern sympathizers who manipulated his weakness. They saw a president who was mentally foggy from opium and physically exhausted, and they steered him where they wished. There is a tragic account of a meeting during the height of the secession crisis. The Union was dissolving. States were leaving. The country looked to the president for a sign, a command, a rally. Buchanan sat at the head of the table, his head tilted to the side, his eyes glassy. He listened to the arguments swirling around him, the shouts of treason, the demands for war, and he said nothing. He simply wrung his hands, a gesture of utter helplessness. He later reportedly told a friend, "I am the last president of the United States." He believed he was presiding over a funeral, his own and the nation's. This is the zombie president, a leader who goes through the motions of office, signing papers, receiving diplomats, hosting dinners, but who is internally dead. The will to power had been extinguished by the bacteria in the water tank. He was a creature of habit, moving blindly through the corridors of power, waiting for the clock to run out. The psychological toll of the assassination theory played a decisive role in this paralysis. Firmly believing that Northern agents had attempted to assassinate him, Buchanan viewed every Republican, every abolitionist, with deep paranoid suspicion. He could not negotiate with Lincoln or his proxies because he saw them not as the opposition but as murderers. This paranoia locked him into a rigid, pro-Southern stance that alienated the only people who could have saved the Union. The poison had created a political wall that he was too weak to climb over. His personal life in the White House was marked by a profound loneliness. Without a wife to comfort him, without children to distract him, he was left alone with his ailments. His niece, Harriet Lane, acted as First Lady and did her best to maintain a facade of gaiety, organizing parties and receptions. But at these events, Buchanan would often stand apart, a grim specter at his own feast, holding a glass of wine he dared not drink, watching the dancers with the detached stare of a man who has already left the world. As 1860 rolled around and the election of Abraham Lincoln signaled the end of his term, Buchanan did not feel anger. He felt relief, a desperate, overwhelming relief. He wanted to lay down the burden. He wanted to go home to Wheatland, his estate in Pennsylvania. He wanted to stop being the president. He wanted to be allowed to be sick in peace, The transition period, the secession winter, was the final act of his martyrdom. As state after state seceded, Buchanan did nothing. He argued that secession was illegal, but that the president had no power to stop it. It was a legalistic knot that a healthy man might have cut with a sword. But Buchanan was not a healthy man. He was a man whose gut was on fire, whose head swam with laudanum, and whose heart had been broken 40 years ago. He watched the country tear itself apart and simply lacked the energy to stop it. On the morning of Lincoln's inauguration, March 4th, 1861, Buchanan arrived to escort his successor. The visual contrast was the final brutal metaphor of his presidency. Lincoln was tall, gaunt, but crackling with nervous energy, a man of iron and wood. Buchanan was gray, bent, and shuffling, a man of dust and fluids. As they rode in the open carriage down Pennsylvania Avenue, the same avenue where Buchanan had ridden 4 years earlier in the grip of the poison, the crowd was silent. There were no cheers for the outgoing president, only a heavy, judging silence. Buchanan turned to Lincoln and delivered the line that has become his epitaph. "My dear sir, if you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, you are a happy man indeed." It was not the statement of a statesman handing over power. It was the sigh of a prisoner being released from a torture chamber. He left Washington immediately. He left behind a broken country, a divided people, and a legacy of failure. But he took something with him. He took the national hotel disease. It was now a permanent part of his biology. The bacteria had colonized him. The poison had changed his cells. The broken survivor went home to die, but the zombie he had become had already done its damage. The Union was dead, and it would require a river of blood, far more than had been spilled in the hotel dining room, to bring it back to life. When James Buchanan fled Washington in March 1861, escaping the cursed city for the safety of his Pennsylvania estate, he believed he had left the horror behind. He was wrong. The horror was just beginning. He had merely passed the baton. Less than 6 weeks after the zombie president left office, the cannons of the Confederacy opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. The paralysis that had gripped Buchanan's administration, a paralysis born of opium, dysentery, and paranoia, had allowed the fracture to widen into a chasm. The time for compromises and legal arguments was over. The time for blood had arrived. As the news of the first battles reached Wheatland, Buchanan sat in his study, an old sick man wrapping a blanket around his ravaged stomach. He watched from a distance as the country he had sworn to protect descended into a slaughterhouse. Every casualty list printed in the newspapers, every report of a burning city, felt like an indictment. The public, looking for a scapegoat for the carnage, turned their eyes collectively towards the former president. They did not see a victim of a biological tragedy. They saw a traitor. They saw a coward. They saw the man who sat on his hands while the Union burned. Letters poured into Wheatland, filled with hate and vitriol. Judas, they called him, traitor. Some even threatened to march on his estate and hang him from his own oak trees. Buchanan spent his final years in a pathetic attempt to wash the blood from his hands. He obsessed over his reputation. He spent his days writing a dense legalistic memoir, Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion. In it, he argued that he had done everything the Constitution allowed. He blamed the North. He blamed the South. He blamed everyone but himself. But no one was listening. The roar of the cannons at Gettysburg, just a few miles from his home, drowned out his ink-stained excuses. But while his reputation died, his body continued its slow, agonizing decay. The national hotel disease had never truly left him. It had merely gone dormant, waiting for the final act. The years at Wheatland were marked by a steady physical decline that mirrored the destruction of the South. The chronic enteritis that had plagued him since the inauguration never healed. His digestion remained a source of constant misery. He aged rapidly, his face becoming a skull draped in loose skin, his eyes retreating further into the dark hollows caused by years of dehydration. He was a man being consumed from the inside out. In May 1868, the end finally came. Buchanan caught a cold, a minor ailment that a healthy man would have shaken off. But James Buchanan was not a healthy man. His immune system, shattered 11 years earlier by the toxic assault of the hotel water, had nothing left to give. The cold deepened into pleurisy. His heart, weakened by the strain of the vomiting and the years of stimulants, began to fail. On June 1st, 1868, at the age of 77, the 15th President of the United States lay on his deathbed. He was lucid to the end, his mind clear even as his body surrendered. His last words were reported to be, "O Lord God Almighty, as thou wilt." He died quietly. But the autopsy of history suggests that he did not die of old age. He died as the final victim of the National Hotel. The poisoning had robbed him of the vitality needed to govern, and finally, it robbed him of the strength to live. The zombie finally stopped moving. Standing figuratively over the grave of James Buchanan, looking back at the ruin of the mid-19th century, history is left with a haunting what if, perhaps the greatest counterfactual in American history. History turns on small hinges. A bullet misses by an inch. A telegram arrives a minute too late. Or in this case, a pipe freezes in a cellar. If the winter of 1857 had been milder, if the plumbing of the National Hotel had been modern, if James Buchanan had not drunk that specific glass of water, imagine a healthy James Buchanan standing on the inaugural platform. A man of vigor, clear-headed, free from pain, free from the haze of opium. Would he have had the strength to stand up to the Southern fire eaters? Would he have had the mental clarity to negotiate a compromise? Would he have been able to delay the war, or perhaps manage the separation without the slaughter? We will never know. The poison took that future away. It replaced a statesman with a patient. It replaced leadership with lethargy. The National Hotel disease was not just a medical curiosity. It was a historical catalyst. It was the butterfly effect played out in bacteria and bile. The tragedy is not just that 40 people died in a hotel. The tragedy is that their deaths created a vacuum of power that sucked 600,000 soldiers into their graves. The blood that was vomited onto the white tablecloths of the National Hotel dining room in January 1857 was the first blood of the Civil War. It was the harbinger. The stench of the hotel corridor was the prelude to the stench of the trenches at Antietam and Cold Harbor. Today, the National Hotel is gone. The building stood for decades, a grim monument to the disaster, before finally being demolished. The site is now occupied by the Newseum and other modern structures on Pennsylvania Avenue. The rats are gone. The arsenic is washed away. The physical evidence has vanished into the mud of the Potomac, but the ghost remains. James Buchanan is remembered as the worst president, but perhaps he should be remembered as the first casualty. He was a man who walked into a gilded trap and was eaten alive by the very city he sought to rule. He was the zombie president, a dead man walking who led a nation of ghosts into the fire. And in the end, the monster within was not just in his gut. It was in the pipes. It was in the politics. It was in the very soul of a nation that was sick unto death, waiting for the fever to break.